Hi everybody, it's Laura. Thank you so much for joining me on my channel. Today I have another layout that I made using a My Creative Scrapbook limited edition kit. The kit that I'm using for today's video is the December 2023 kit. I'm using one of the cut files that's available to all My Creative Scrapbook subscribers. And this says 25. I have cut out the cut file, and then I've also cut out a solid piece behind it without the inner cuts. And on that piece, I'm going to be mounting a number of strips of paper. I'm actually going to cover the entire thing with all of these strips. Some of the strips I'm using have a straight edge, and then you can see here that I'm ripping some of the pattern paper so that there'll be some that have an irregular torn edge. For the torn strips, I'm just using one piece of pattern paper. I'm going to be using the A side and the B side. On the front of the pattern paper are these really cute gingerbread men, and on the back is a dotted pattern. I'm going to be using both of those on this layout. I'm going to ink all of these strips, the straight ones and the torn edge ones, with some distress ink in Vintage Photo. Inking edges of pattern papers is something I do all the time, but I found that it's very important for me, for the way that I want the layout to turn out, to ink the edges when I use strips of paper layered on top of each other. Once I forgot to do that, and although I wasn't unhappy with the layout, I did wish that I had inked the edges. I just really like the look. It provides a little bit more of a separation between the individual strips when the edges are inked. You can see here that I am kind of winging it. I wasn't sure exactly how I wanted this to look, so I started out putting down some of the strips with the straight edges, and then my plan is to layer the torn edge strips on top of those straight edge strips. I like to use this, I guess you could call it a technique, of using strips of paper right next to each other on a layout in some manner quite a bit. And I like to make sure that the different patterns are spread throughout the entire area that I'm covering with the strips. I also try to be careful about color. I don't want too many pattern papers that are the same color next to each other. I want to also make sure that I spread the different colors throughout the entire area. Now I have a number of straight strips down, and I have one strip that has the torn edges attached, and I'm attempting to add a second one here. I love this gingerbread man that you could see on this pattern paper, so I'm trying to make sure that he's visible. And then on top of that torn strip, I add a couple more of the straight strips of paper. And then I continue around the entire cut file like this. I have generally more of the straight edge pieces and just a couple of the ones with the torn edges. And then I cut away the excess strips in small sections as I go along. Now, although I wanted to make sure that you could see the little gingerbread man, I thought that that strip of torn paper was a little bit too wide, so I decided to go back in and tear a little bit of the paper off of it. And then I'm also going to go back at the end. I don't think that I have this on camera, and I ruffle up the edges of all of those torn papers to add a little bit more texture. And I just use my fingers to bend the edges and rip them up a little bit more in a few cases. So I continued adding the strips until I had covered the entire cut file, and then I used a little bit of gel glue just to make sure that the edges were secure. Now I'm adding some gel glue to the actual cut file. I'm going to layer that on top of the number 25. The way that I make that solid 25 using a cut file is on my Silhouette Cameo. I will release the compound path on the whole cut file, and then I will drag the inner part of the numbers out, and that makes the large solid piece that I can then cut out. And if you have any questions about that, let me know. I think there's a way that I can do a screen recording and show you how I do it if that's something that you're interested in seeing. It's quite easy, and I think it opens up a whole bunch of possibilities with cut files. I wanted to stitch on the cut file, and I have to say that I've never been successful with showing how I stitch. So here I'm just showing you how I punch some holes. I have a little punchy tool and a mat underneath the cut file, and I'm punching some holes. I just do it by eye, and then I apologize, I didn't show you the final product after I stitched it, but you'll see that in just a couple of minutes. I'm going to use this piece of striped pattern paper for my background. I cut it a little bit smaller than 12 by 12 and mounted it on a piece of white pattern paper. And then I wanted to hold down these ends of the thread, so I use a little bit of washi tape to help me with that. Sometimes I glue them down, but the washi tape is very easy to use. Now I've picked out a number of the embellishments that I'm going to use on the layout, and I'm inking all of them with some Distress ink in Vintage Photo. You could also see that there are some dimensional flowers that I'm going to use. I wanted the cut file to really pop off the page, so I used a piece of glitter paper from my stash, and this time I used the offset feature on my Silhouette Cameo, and I made the same shape but just a little bit bigger so there would be a gold mat all around the outside. In general, I am not a real glitter person for my choice of dress or for the items that I buy. I don't usually choose things that are shiny and bright and glittery and blingy, but for scrapbooking, I think that's a great time to be able to include all of that stuff in what I make. So especially for Christmas layouts, I love using lots and lots of glitter and gold and blingy things. I think that those things really make the Christmas layouts special. So I distressed the edges of the pattern paper I have in my background, and then I even bent up the paper in a couple of areas just to make it a little bit more interesting. And I know from past experience that ATG adhesive isn't enough to attach my cut file down to this glitter paper. I knew that if I wanted these two papers to stay attached together, I would have to use some wet glue. And then to attach the cut file down to the background, I used ATG adhesive. And I very much like to use the ATG adhesive to attach the cut files down to the background, just in case I have to move it around a little bit. Once I start working on my layout, sometimes I change my mind about exactly where I want it. So I think it's really good to have an adhesive that isn't as permanent as glue and allows me to move things around. I'm using two photos for this layout. I cut them into circles. I use my Creative Memories circle cutters, which I absolutely love. I use those all the time. And I have one photo at the top and one at the bottom. And these are both pictures of my daughters, actually on Christmas Eve, not on Christmas, but Christmas Eve is when we take most of our photos, and then Christmas Day is a little bit more relaxed. So I just decided I would go ahead and use the 25 for my Christmas Eve pictures because this is such an important part of Christmas to us. And since I wanted the photos to sit on top of the cut file, I put some foam on the area that's not sitting on the cut file so that the photos will sit properly on the page. I don't always start with flowers, but for this layout, I decided I was going to arrange the flowers in the two flower clusters I'm going to have as my first order of business. And I especially loved the flowers in this kit. The pink and blue flowers have a beautiful gold edge to them, and then that goes along so nicely with those smaller poinsettias. So I didn't attach anything down, but I have the flower clusters where they're going to go, and then I began adding some of the other embellishments that I plan to include on the page. So in the lower right-hand corner, I have Santa's sleigh with some sentiments underneath it. And then in the upper left-hand corner, I have some tickets. And then I decided to include this die cut of this little girl who's waving, holding a Christmas tree, and with a mitten on. I also included some candy canes in the cluster at the top. Here I'm adding some dimension to the sleigh with a little bit of foam. I have 3 sentiments underneath the sleigh. I end up only using 2. It just looked like that area was getting a little bit too crowded. And one of them says Sweet Holiday and the other one says Winter Wonderland. And then I begin attaching everything down. And I'm wondering what Prima will come out with this year for their Christmas collection. They always have these pastel collections that I really love, and I wonder if they'll do the same thing this year. Now I'm going to attach down my flowers. I'm using some heavy gel matte medium to do that. In addition to the flowers, I'm also including some other embellishments that came in the flower packs. I believe that these are berries. Not 100% sure, but they're just so decorative and perfect for Christmas that I couldn't help including them. So there are pink ones, and there are also some that have gold on them, and they're really stunning. So I tucked a couple of those into both of the clusters. And then to fill out the cluster, I added some of these pine branches. These are die cut from some white glitter paper, and I just thought that they would be nice to fill out the cluster and make them look a little bit more substantial. And even though this is sped up more than 3 times, I think you can get an idea here of how much I work on each cluster to get all of the elements just the way that I want them. I think that just slight changes in the way things are positioned can really make a big difference in how the cluster looks. And I also feel like you really don't know how to arrange them until you try. So I think that trial and error is a good way to see what looks best. So I do invest a decent amount of time in arranging all of these elements so that they all work together. And I put a small piece of foam under both of the large flowers to lift them up a little bit, just so that they would sit more on line with the cut file and not look like they were sitting below it. For these branches, I used some dies that were in my stash. You could see one of them to the right of my scissors on my table. I tend to buy a lot of branch and floral related dies because I find that I use those a lot. And now I tend to buy the bigger brands, but when I first started out scrapbooking, I bought a lot of them from eBay and they weren't branded. So I apologize that I often can't tell you where to get the dies that I use. But now that I buy a lot of name brand dies, I have noticed that there is no shortage of branch and leaf dies and flower dies too. They are everywhere, and I feel like if I'm not careful, I just keep buying very similar ones over and over. So I do try to be careful of that now, but there are so many opportunities to build up your stash of things like branches and leaves. I'm using some self-adhesive strips of pearls, and I put those around my photo. Now I have to say that I find that generally when I put these pearls in a circle, they'll pop up. So if that does happen, I go back in with some glossy accents and I attach them back down again. Once they're attached down with glossy accents, they're not going anywhere. So this was my attempt to make both of the photos into little ornaments. I used some of the gold glitter paper that I used on the layout behind the cut file. And then I also used some gold wire that I had in my stash. I'm wrapping it around my dauber to make it curved. You really don't see these too well in the final layout because I decided to put a bow on the top of both of the ornaments. But I'm going to consider using this idea again because it was very simple to do, and I think that they look pretty much like the ornaments that we used to have on our Christmas tree when we used the older style ornaments. After I attached the wire to the glitter paper, I attached one down to the top of each of the photos. Now there were these 2 cute little gingerbread men, and I absolutely love them. I wanted to cut the white edge off of both of them, and then of course I had to ink the edges with the Distress ink. And then after I inked the edges, I decided that I was going to tuck them into the number 25 so that they're just kind of peeking out from behind the number. And I really liked that. I thought that they looked really cute. This is where I added some bows that I had. I used a pink one and a blue one. I put the pink one on the photo that had the blue flower next to it and the blue one on the photo that had the pink flower next to it, just to make sure I had those colors spread throughout the layout. And unfortunately, you can see that those bows really do cover the little metal piece that I made. But the important thing is that I like the overall look of it. I'm not going to not include the bows because I don't want to cover something up. And then I was thinking that I liked the way the gingerbread men looked without that white border, so I decided to remove the white border from this little girl embellishment. Sometimes the white border comes in so handy, and other times I don't want to have it on my layout, so I really don't mind when it's included because I do want to use it sometimes. So it's easy enough to fussy cut that off, and then I inked the edges of it. And then I tucked it right back where I had it on the left-hand side of my layout. Now I'm adding some pearls to the flowers. Here I'm using some glossy accents and I'm attaching down some pearls of different sizes. I just added a couple to each of the large flowers. On my glossy accents, there's a special top that I bought, and it only worked for a really short period of time before it clogged up, but it was really wonderful while it was working because it's a very precise tip. So I was able to get that glossy accents onto my flowers very easily and with really great precision, but unfortunately it clogged pretty quickly. I'm not sure if I did something wrong, but now I'm back to just sticking a pin in the top of my glossy accents. And now I'm adding a little bit more sparkle and shine to those flowers with some opal glitter medium, and that was the last touch, and here are some close-ups. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope that you enjoyed watching it. I took a little break from my creative scrapbook this summer because I knew that I wasn't going to have a lot of creative time, but I'm going to be starting up designing for them again in the fall. So you'll be seeing some videos from the current kits very soon. If you've been following me for a while, you probably know that I genuinely love the limited edition kit. So I highly recommend the limited edition kit, but my creative scrapbook has a number of kits for all different tastes. I hope you have a fantastic day, and I hope you'll join me again soon. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.